He said she was just a friend. For 3 years, I believed him. Then I found the photos hidden in his laptop, vacation pictures they took while I was visiting my sick mother. When I handed him the envelope at our anniversary dinner, surrounded by all our friends and family, his face went completely white. What happened next changed everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh. Anna, could you grab us some more wine while we finish discussing the wedding plans? Eric didn't even look at me as he dismissed me from our own dining room table. Our dining room table in the house I had saved for 3 years to help buy. I smiled tightly and nodded, stepping away while Eric and his sister Sylvie continued planning what was supposed to be our engagement party. The engagement party I had researched venues for, the guest list I had carefully curated, the budget I had meticulously planned. But somehow, in the span of 2 hours, I had been relegated from co-planner to wine server. I wasn't always invisible in my own life. There was a time when Eric would pull me close at gatherings, his arm warm around my waist as he introduced me to his colleagues. This is Anna Lewis, my brilliant girlfriend. She's the creative genius behind Meridian Design Studio. He'd beam with genuine pride as I explained our latest architectural projects to potential clients. Back then, we were partners in every sense. I remember the night that saved my entire career. 2 years ago, I was competing for the biggest contract of my life, designing a luxury resort complex in Colorado. My presentation was scheduled for the next morning, but at 11 p.m., I discovered that my main competitor had somehow obtained my preliminary designs. Someone had leaked my concepts, and they were planning to present a nearly identical proposal first. Eric found me at midnight, surrounded by drafting papers and coffee cups, completely starting over from scratch. "It's impossible, Anna," he had said, collapsing onto our sofa. "There's no way you can create something entirely new in 8 hours. Maybe we should postpone." "Give me until sunrise," I replied, not looking up from my drawing tablet. By 6 a.m., I had designed something completely revolutionary, a resort that seemed to grow organically from the mountainside itself, using sustainable materials and innovative engineering that had never been attempted before. When I finally showed Eric the renderings, he lifted me off my feet and spun me around our small apartment. "This is why I love you," he had whispered against my hair. "You see possibilities where others see walls." The clients awarded me the contract unanimously. The resort would go on to win 3 international architecture awards and establish my reputation in the industry. Now, 2 years later, I stood in our kitchen opening a bottle of wine for people who barely acknowledged my presence in conversations about my own engagement party. Our relationship had evolved considerably since those early days. We had a beautiful house in Riverside Heights, a thriving business, and a social circle that envied our seemingly perfect partnership. But somewhere during that climb, something fundamental had shifted. I carried the wine back to the dining room, refilling glasses silently. As I poured the last glass beside Eric, he glanced up briefly. "Thanks, babe." Then, turning back to Sylvie, "Now, as I was saying about the venue booking." My venue research, my contacts in the catering industry, my vision for how the event should flow, now delivered in his voice as if he had conceived every detail himself. I took my seat at the far end of the table. I hadn't always sat there. Once, my chair had been right beside his. Week by week, gathering by gathering, I had been subtly relocated. First across from him, then down one seat, now practically outside the conversation entirely. "Eric," I interrupted, as he was midway through explaining my catering recommendations to his sister, "I think we should discuss the timing concerns I mentioned earlier. The venue has restrictions on noise levels after 10 p.m. that could impact the dancing portion." The room fell awkwardly silent. Eric's smile remained fixed, but something cold flashed behind his eyes. I've got this handled, Anna. We'll work out those minor details after we finalize the main elements. Minor details? The legal restrictions that could result in fines or early shutdown of our event. Actually, said his Uncle Mike, I'd like to hear Anna's thoughts on this. She knows the venue business better than any of us. Eric smoothly interjected. We're running short on time tonight. Anna's prepared some detailed notes on the logistics. I'll have them distributed later. Anna's prepared notes, not Anna has great insights or Anna's the expert here. Just documentation to be distributed later, as if my 3 years of event planning experience were merely secretarial support. After everyone left, I confronted him in our home office. Once our shared workspace, now predominantly his, with my desk pushed into the corner by the window. You completely dismissed me in there, I said, closing the door behind me. Eric sighed, loosening his tie. Don't be dramatic, Anna. I was managing the flow of the conversation. My family doesn't respond well to too much input from too many sources. Your family was about to make decisions based on incomplete information I tried to provide. Everything worked out fine, he said, barely looking up from his phone. We accomplished what we needed to accomplish. That's not the point, and you know it. He finally looked at me, impatience etched across his features. What exactly is the point, then? That I didn't let you micromanage a simple family discussion? I stared at him, this stranger wearing my boyfriend's face. The point is that you're erasing me from my own life. You're overthinking this, he said, the dismissal so casual it felt like a physical blow. Relationships evolve. Different situations require different approaches. Different approaches? Like him attending industry networking events alone, events we used to attend together. Like forgetting to mention when his college friends were in town. Like coming home from work dinners with the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his jacket. The signs had been accumulating for months. The distance, the dismissals, the way he would check his phone and smile at messages that clearly weren't from me. I wasn't blind. I just wasn't ready to connect the dots. That evening, we hosted a small dinner party for some of our mutual friends. As couples mingled in our living room, I overheard Eric introducing me to Stephen Miser, a new client I had never met before. This is Anna, my girlfriend. She keeps everything organized behind the scenes. Behind the scenes? As if I were a stage manager rather than the lead architect in our shared success story. Something hardened inside me that night. As I served drinks and smiled at appropriate moments, I observed myself from a distance, this polished, efficient ghost of a woman I had become. Presentable, helpful, powerless. The woman who used to design award-winning buildings had been reduced to serving wine and taking notes. But that was about to change. 3 years earlier, Eric and I were inseparable, not just romantically, but professionally. We had met at a sustainable architecture conference in Denver, where I was presenting my thesis on eco-friendly urban planning. He was working for a mid-sized development firm, ambitious, but stuck in a role that didn't utilize his natural talent for client relations and project coordination. I can still picture him that day, leaning against the back wall during my presentation, completely captivated as I explained how buildings could work in harmony with their natural environment, rather than fighting against it. Afterward, he approached me with an enthusiasm I rarely saw in my academic circles. Your vision could change everything, he had said, his eyes bright with possibility. But you need someone who understands the business side, someone who can translate your brilliance into language that clients and investors understand. He wasn't wrong. I was a talented designer, but I struggled with the commercial aspects of architecture. Numbers made sense to me when they related to load-bearing calculations or material specifications, but budgets, timelines, and client management felt like foreign languages. Our partnership began organically. Eric would attend my client meetings, watching how I fumbled through cost discussions and timeline negotiations.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Afterward, he'd gently suggest better approaches. Anna, when you mentioned the timeline, you sounded uncertain. Clients need to feel confident that you have everything under control. Within 6 months, we had developed a perfect rhythm. I would create the designs, innovative, beautiful, technically sound concepts that pushed the boundaries of what architecture could achieve. Eric would handle the presentation, translating my technical expertise into compelling narratives that clients could envision for themselves. Our first major success was the Riverside Community Center. The city had been struggling with an aging facility that needed complete reconstruction, but their budget was limited, and the environmental restrictions were complex. Most firms had submitted conventional proposals, standard community center designs that met the basic requirements but offered nothing special. I spent weeks studying the site, understanding how the building could work with the natural water flow patterns, how the existing trees could be preserved and integrated into the design, how natural lighting could reduce energy costs by 60%. The technical challenges were immense, but I thrived on solving impossible puzzles. Eric was the one who understood how to present these innovations. During our proposal meeting, he painted a picture of children learning about sustainability through the building itself, of community members feeling connected to nature even while indoors, of a facility that would become a model for environmentally conscious public architecture across the state. When we won that contract, Eric swept me up in his arms right there in the city planning office. The committee members smiled at our enthusiasm, clearly charmed by our dynamic. Later, over celebratory drinks, Eric raised his glass and said, "To the most incredible woman I know, you don't just design buildings, Anna, you design dreams." That phrase became our private motto. Whenever projects got difficult, whenever clients demanded impossible timelines or budget cuts that seemed to compromise the integrity of the work, Eric would remind me, "We don't just design buildings, we design dreams." The Colorado Resort project was our masterpiece together. Eric had identified the opportunity through his network, recognizing that the client was looking for something revolutionary rather than merely functional. He arranged the initial meetings, prepared the presentation materials, and positioned us as the innovative choice in a field of conservative competitors. But when the crisis hit, when we discovered our preliminary designs had been stolen, Eric's faith in me never wavered. While I panicked, convinced our career was over before it had truly begun, he simply rolled up his sleeves and prepared to support me through the all-night redesign session. He brought me coffee every hour. He answered my phone calls so I wouldn't be interrupted. When I needed a specific material specification at 3 a.m., he called his contacts until he found the information. He believed in my ability to create something extraordinary under pressure, even when I didn't believe in myself. The morning of the presentation, as I stood before the client panel feeling exhausted but confident in my revolutionary design, Eric whispered in my ear, "Show them dreams, Anna. Show them what the future looks like." I did exactly that. The presentation was flawless, the design groundbreaking, the client response overwhelming. When they announced their decision to award us the contract, Eric's pride was visible to everyone in the room. He didn't try to share the spotlight or claim partial credit for the creative work. Instead, he stood behind me as the clients congratulated my innovative vision, his hand supportive on my shoulder. "Anna Lewis is going to change how we think about architecture," he told the lead client. "I'm just lucky enough to be part of her journey." The resort project launched our careers into a completely different stratosphere. Architecture magazines featured my work. Industry conferences invited me to speak. Eric coordinated everything seamlessly, managing our growing client list while ensuring I had the time and space to focus on design work. During those golden months, our personal and professional lives were perfectly integrated. We would work late into the evening, discussing projects over dinner, sketching modifications on napkins, dreaming about the buildings we would create together. Eric would suggest business strategies, while I refined design concepts, and somehow every decision felt like a true collaboration. "We're going to build an empire together," he used to say as we lay in bed planning our future. Not just a business, but a legacy. Buildings that will stand for centuries, with both our names on them. I believed him completely. Why wouldn't I? Every day, he demonstrated his commitment to our shared vision. Every project reinforced our complementary strengths. Every success felt like validation of our partnership. Looking back now, I can see the exact moment when things began to shift. It was subtle at first, so subtle that I didn't recognize the change until months later. But the seeds of my eventual invisibility were planted during our greatest triumph. The night we celebrated winning the resort contract, surrounded by industry colleagues and potential clients, someone asked Eric about our design process. Instead of immediately directing the question to me, he paused for just a moment and began explaining the conceptual approach himself. "We believe architecture should respond to its environment," he said confidently. "Our design philosophy centers on sustainability, innovation. We believe. Our philosophy. Not Anna's vision or Anna's approach." For the first time, Eric had positioned himself as co-creator rather than facilitator. I didn't correct him. The distinction felt minor in the moment, and his enthusiasm was infectious. Everyone was impressed by our success, and I was too caught up in the celebration to worry about precise attribution. But that night marked the beginning of a gradual transformation that would eventually lead to me serving wine while Eric planned our engagement party. 18 months after the Colorado resort opened, we faced the crisis that would define both my career and expose the first major crack in our relationship. The Ocean View mixed-use development was the largest project we had ever attempted, a $40 million complex that would include luxury condominiums, retail spaces, and a boutique hotel, all built on a challenging coastal site with strict environmental regulations. The project had been in development for 8 months when disaster struck. During a routine soil analysis required for the final permits, engineers discovered that the ground beneath our planned foundation was far more unstable than initial surveys had indicated. Decades of coastal erosion had created underground cavities that made our original structural design completely impossible. The client, Harrison Gold, was not a patient man. He had already invested millions in land acquisition and preliminary work, and his financing was contingent on breaking ground within 6 weeks. When our structural engineer delivered the devastating news on a Thursday afternoon, Harrison's response was immediate and unforgiving. "Fix it, or I'll find architects who can." That evening, Eric paced our apartment with the manic energy of someone watching their future collapse. "There's no way to redesign the entire structural system in 6 weeks," he said, running his hands through his hair repeatedly. "The foundation engineering alone would take months to calculate and approve. We need to call Harrison tomorrow and recommend postponing until next year." "Give me the weekend," I said quietly, already pulling out my engineering textbooks and calling up geological survey databases on my laptop. "Anna, be realistic. This isn't like redesigning the facade or adjusting the floor plans. We're talking about fundamental structural integrity on unstable ground. You'd have to reinvent how buildings interact with coastal soil conditions." But I was already deep in calculations, my mind racing through possibilities that most architects would never consider. The traditional approach would indeed be impossible. Driving deep foundations through unstable soil to reach bedrock would be prohibitively expensive and environmentally destructive. But what if we stopped fighting the soil conditions and started thinking about working with them? I spent Friday night researching floating foundation systems used in earthquake-prone regions. Saturday was devoted to studying how Venice's ancient buildings remained stable on swampy ground for centuries. By Sunday morning, I had identified a revolutionary approach that combined modern engineering with principles borrowed from ship design. Instead of anchoring the building deep into unstable ground, I would design it to literally float on the soil, a massive concrete mat foundation that would distribute weight so evenly that ground instability became irrelevant. The building would move slightly with seasonal soil changes, but engineered flexible joints would prevent any structural damage. The technical challenges were immense. Every connection point needed to accommodate minor movement. The utility systems required flexible couplings throughout. The elevator systems needed special dampening mechanisms. But by Sunday evening, I had solved each problem with elegant engineering solutions that had never been attempted in coastal construction. Eric found me Monday morning surrounded by blueprints, calculations, and 3D modeling printouts that covered every surface of our home office. "Anna, you haven't slept in 3 days," he said, concern evident in his voice. "Look at this," I said, pointing to my computer screen where a detailed structural animation showed how the building would respond to soil movement. "It's not just possible, it's going to be safer and more environmentally sound than conventional construction." Eric studied the designs with growing amazement. The floating foundation system I had developed would require 60% less excavation, eliminate the need for environmentally disruptive deep drilling, and create a building that would remain stable even during severe coastal storms. "This is genius," he whispered, and I could see the exact moment when he realized what I had accomplished. "Anna, you didn't just solve our problem, you invented an entirely new approach to coastal construction." The presentation to Harrison Gold was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon. As we prepared, Eric was more excited than I had seen him in months. "Wait until he sees what you've created. This is going to revolutionize how we build on coastal sites. Every architect in the country is going to want to license your floating foundation system." But when we entered Harrison's conference room, something shifted in Eric's demeanor. Harrison was there with his entire development team, his investors, and several local officials who would need to approve the innovative construction methods. The room was full of powerful people who controlled not just this project, but potentially our entire future in large-scale development. As I began explaining the floating foundation concept, I noticed Eric watching the room's reactions more than focusing on my presentation. When one of the investors looked confused during my explanation of soil displacement calculations, Eric smoothly interjected. "What Anna is describing," he said, "is essentially a boat foundation. Instead of fighting the unstable soil, we're designing the building to work with natural ground movement." His explanation was accurate but oversimplified, reducing my complex engineering innovation to a folksy metaphor. The investors nodded with understanding, but I felt a strange unease at having my technical achievement translated into something that sounded almost quaint. As the presentation continued, Eric inserted himself more frequently. When I explained the flexible joint systems, he added commentary about adaptive architecture. When I detailed the environmental benefits, he expanded on our philosophy of sustainable development. By the end of the meeting, Harrison and his team were thoroughly impressed, but their praise was directed as much to Eric as to me, despite the fact that every innovation had come from my sleepless weekend of engineering problem-solving. "This is exactly the kind of creative thinking we need," Harrison said as we packed up our materials. "You two make a hell of a team." "You two?" As if the revolutionary foundation system had emerged from collaborative brainstorming rather than my individual technical expertise. Walking back to our car, Eric was euphoric. "That went perfectly. Harrison loved the concept, and I could tell his investors were impressed by our presentation style." Our presentation style? I had done 90% of the talking, explaining complex engineering principles I had developed independently, but somehow it had become our presentation? "The foundation system is going to change everything, Anna," Eric continued. "We should start preparing patent applications and thinking about licensing opportunities. This could be the breakthrough that establishes us as the premier coastal development firm on the West Coast." Us. We. Are. The pronouns had shifted so subtly that I almost missed their significance. But something deep in my chest felt tight with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. That night, as Eric called his contacts to share news of our breakthrough, I sat alone in our office looking at the blueprints I had created through 3 days of intensive engineering work. Every calculation bore my handwriting. Every innovative solution had emerged from my understanding of structural dynamics. Every breakthrough had been the product of my individual expertise. But somehow, in the span of a single presentation, it had become our achievement. I told myself I was being petty. Eric had been supportive throughout the weekend. He had handled the client relationship professionally, his enthusiasm was genuine, and his pride in my work was obvious. Partnerships meant sharing credit, didn't they? But late that night, as Eric slept beside me, I found myself staring at the ceiling and wondering when I had started needing permission to feel proud of my own accomplishments. The Ocean View project became our signature achievement, launching us into a completely different tier of architectural practice. The floating foundation system I had developed was indeed revolutionary, leading to consulting opportunities across the country and establishing new standards for coastal construction. But in every article written about the project, in every industry presentation, in every client meeting that followed, the innovation was consistently described as something we had developed. My individual breakthrough had been absorbed into our collective identity so seamlessly that even I sometimes forgot it had originated from my solitary weekend of problem solving. That was the beginning of my disappearance. 2 years after the Ocean View success, I had become a ghost in my own life. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It was a gradual erosion so subtle that I barely noticed each individual compromise until I looked up one day and realized I was completely invisible. Our morning routine perfectly illustrated how far things had shifted. Eric would wake up first, shower, and dress for the day, while I prepared breakfast and coffee. As he ate, he would scroll through emails and take calls from potential clients, his voice animated and confident as he discussed our latest projects and our innovative approaches. I would sit across from him with my own coffee, reviewing the technical drawings I had worked on late into the previous evening, making notes about structural modifications or environmental impact assessments. But Eric rarely asked about my work anymore. My contributions had become background noise to the symphony of his networking and business development. "I've got lunch with the Morrison Group today," he would announce, referencing a major development firm that had been courting us for months. "They're interested in that mixed-use concept we discussed." The mixed-use concept I had designed, the innovative retail-residential integration that I had spent weeks perfecting, balancing traffic flow with privacy concerns, optimizing natural lighting while maintaining energy efficiency. But in Eric's casual reference, it had become something we discussed, as if it had emerged from a casual conversation rather than my intensive design work. Our office dynamics had evolved in similarly troubling ways. We still shared the same workspace, but my role had gradually shifted from creative partner to technical support. Eric would meet with prospective clients, presenting preliminary concepts and design philosophies, while I worked quietly at my drafting table, refining the actual architectural drawings that would make his promises possible. During client presentations, I had been relegated to the role of technical consultant. Eric would handle the creative vision and conceptual discussions, occasionally turning to me for confirmation of specific details. "Anna, you've run the structural calculations on this, right? Can you confirm the load-bearing capacity for the client?" I wasn't being asked for my architectural insights or design innovations. I was being asked to verify numbers, like a human calculator brought in to support Eric's presentations. The most painful moments were when clients would ask direct questions about the design process. Instead of allowing me to respond with the detailed explanations I was fully capable of providing, Eric would often answer on my behalf. "Anna's incredibly thorough with the technical aspects," he would say, his tone warm but subtly condescending. "She makes sure all my creative ideas are actually buildable." My creative ideas that I had developed, researched, and refined, now described as technical translations of his creative vision. I began keeping a private journal, documenting these small erasures. Reading through the entries months later, I could see a clear pattern. March 15th. Client meeting about the waterfront hotel. Eric presented my adaptive foundation design as our innovative approach to challenging sites. Didn't mention that I had developed the entire structural system independently. April 3rd. Industry mixer. 3 different people complimented Eric on his floating foundation technique. He accepted the praise without correcting them or mentioning my role in developing the system. May 18th. Architecture Today magazine interview. Eric spoke for 45 minutes about our design philosophy and our breakthrough coastal construction methods. I wasn't included in the interview, despite being the engineer who created the innovations they wanted to discuss. The entries revealed a troubling escalation. Each month, Eric became more comfortable claiming individual credit for collaborative work, while my contributions became more invisible to the outside world. But the personal changes were even more disturbing than the professional ones. Eric had started attending industry events alone, claiming that smaller networking gatherings were more efficient with one person representing the firm. These were the same events where I used to make valuable connections with structural engineers, environmental consultants, and innovative contractors who enhanced our project capabilities. "You don't really enjoy those cocktail party conversations anyway," Eric would say when I asked about being excluded. "You prefer to focus on the technical work, and someone needs to be here managing the projects while I'm building relationships." He wasn't wrong that I disliked small talk and networking schmoozing, but those events weren't just social opportunities. They were where I learned about new materials, emerging construction techniques, and regulatory changes that directly impacted my design work. By excluding me, Eric was cutting me off from professional development that was crucial to my expertise. Our personal relationship had suffered similar deterioration. Eric's attention was increasingly focused on his phone, on calls with clients and colleagues that seemed to extend from early morning through late evening. When I tried to discuss project ideas or industry developments, he would listen with the polite but distracted attention he might give to a chatty neighbor. He wasn't wrong that I disliked small talk and networking schmoozing, but those events weren't just social opportunities. They were where I learned about new materials, emerging construction techniques, and regulatory changes that directly impacted my design work. By excluding me, Eric was cutting me off from professional development that was crucial to my expertise. Our personal relationship had suffered similar deterioration. Eric's attention was increasingly focused on his phone, on calls with clients and colleagues that seemed to extend from early morning through late evening. When I tried to discuss project ideas or industry developments, he would listen with the polite but distracted attention he might give to a chatty neighbor. "That's interesting, Anna," he would say, not looking up from his screen. "We should definitely explore that further when things slow down a bit." Things never slowed down, and we never explored my ideas further. The most telling change was how Eric had begun describing our relationship to others. At social gatherings, when people asked about our work, Eric would explain that Anna handles the technical side while I focus on the creative and business development. Handles the technical side, as if architecture were divided into creative work, valuable, and technical work, functional but secondary. As if the structural innovations that had built our reputation were merely the implementation of his creative vision rather than creative breakthroughs in their own right. I started paying attention to how other professional couples navigated similar dynamics. At dinner parties, I watched lawyers who both practiced at different firms, doctors who worked in related specialties, business partners who maintained individual identities within collaborative ventures. In healthy professional relationships, both partners took pride in each other's specific contributions. They highlighted each other's expertise rather than absorbing it. But Eric had begun treating my expertise as an extension of his own capabilities, rather than a complementary but distinct skill set. When people complimented our work, he accepted the praise on behalf of both of us. When clients asked technical questions, he would answer them as if the knowledge were his own, rather than referring them to me as the actual expert. I was disappearing, not just from our business, but from my own professional identity. The woman who had revolutionized coastal construction methods was being introduced as someone who handled technical details. The architect who had solved impossible engineering challenges was being described as support staff for someone else's creative vision. And the most disturbing part was how gradually I had started to accept this diminished role. When clients directed technical questions to Eric instead of to me, I no longer corrected the assumption. When industry articles credited Lewis & Associates for my innovations without mentioning my individual contributions, I told myself that partnerships required shared recognition. I was disappearing, and I had become complicit in my own erasure. But something was about to happen that would wake me up from this passive acceptance. Something that would force me to see exactly how far Eric was willing to go in rewriting the story of our success. And it would involve someone I had never suspected of betrayal. The breaking point came during what should have been one of the proudest moments of my career. The Regional Architecture Council had invited me, specifically me, to present at their annual symposium about innovative coastal construction techniques. The invitation letter was addressed to Anna Lewis, Principal Engineer, Lewis & Associates, acknowledging my individual expertise in floating foundation systems. I had been preparing for weeks, creating detailed, technical presentations that would demonstrate how my engineering innovations could be applied to various coastal challenges. This was my opportunity to step out of Eric's shadow and claim recognition for the work I had actually done. 2 days before the symposium, Eric casually mentioned over breakfast that he would be joining me for the presentation. I thought it might be good for both of us to be there, he said, buttering his toast with studied nonchalance. The audience will include some major potential clients, and we should present a unified company vision. Something cold settled in my stomach. Eric, they specifically invited me to speak about the technical engineering aspects. This isn't a business development opportunity, it's a technical symposium. Of course, he agreed quickly, but you know how these industry events work. There's always networking happening alongside to formal presentations. It makes sense for me to be there to handle the relationship building while you focus on the technical content. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't articulate exactly why his presence felt like a threat. On the surface, his reasoning sounded supportive. Partners should support each other's professional opportunities, shouldn't they? The morning of the symposium, I felt confident and prepared. I had rehearsed my presentation until I could deliver it flawlessly, and my technical demonstrations were compelling proof of the innovations I had developed. This was my moment to establish my individual professional identity beyond Eric's expanding shadow. But as we arrived at the conference center, Eric's behavior immediately set off alarm bells. He positioned himself prominently beside me during the pre-presentation meet and greet, introducing himself to attendees as my partner in a way that was ambiguous enough to suggest either business collaboration or a romantic relationship. When Dr. Sylvie Fitz, the symposium coordinator, approached to discuss the presentation format, Eric inserted himself into the conversation before I could respond. Anna's prepared an excellent technical overview, he told Dr. Fitz, but I thought it might be valuable to provide some context about how these innovations fit into our broader design philosophy. Our broader design philosophy. My individual invitation to speak about my specific technical expertise was being transformed into a joint presentation about our approach. Actually, Dr. Fitz said, consulting her notes, we specifically requested Anna because of her individual contributions to floating foundation engineering. The audience is primarily composed of structural engineers and coastal specialists who want to understand the technical details of her innovations. I felt a surge of validation. Finally, someone was recognizing my work as distinct from Eric's business development efforts. But Eric's smile never wavered. Of course, Anna will handle all the technical content. I'll just provide brief introductory remarks about how these innovations emerged from our collaborative research process. Collaborative research process. The weekend I had spent alone, desperately solving the Ocean View Foundation crisis while Eric slept, had somehow become collaborative research. When we took the stage, Eric stepped to the microphone first. What followed was 8 minutes of him explaining our design methodology and our breakthrough thinking to an audience that had come specifically to hear about my engineering work. My partner Anna and I have always believed that innovation comes from questioning fundamental assumptions, he said, his voice carrying the confident authority of someone presenting his own ideas. When we encountered the Ocean View Foundation challenge, we knew we needed to think beyond conventional structural approaches. We knew, we needed to think. My individual problem-solving had been absorbed into a collective narrative that positioned Eric as co-creator of innovations he had literally slept through. As Eric continued his introduction, I watched the audience's attention drift. These were technical professionals who had come for engineering details, not philosophical discussions about design methodology. Several people in the front row were checking their phones, clearly disappointed by the unexpected business speak. When Eric finally introduced me, Anna will now walk you through the technical specifications that made our vision possible, I felt a surge of humiliation that caught me completely off guard. I wasn't being presented as the innovator who had developed revolutionary engineering solutions. I was being introduced as the technical translator of Eric's creative vision. But the worst moment came during the question and answer period. Dr. Marcus Jones, a respected coastal engineer from UC Berkeley, raised his hand with a complex question about load distribution calculations in variable soil conditions. Before I could respond, Eric leaned toward my microphone. "That's an excellent question. The load distribution approach we developed requires careful analysis of soil compression ratios." He was answering a highly technical engineering question using terminology he barely understood, cobbling together phrases from my presentations without grasping their actual meaning. I watched Dr. Jones's expression shift from interest to confusion to barely concealed irritation as Eric delivered a response that sounded authoritative but was fundamentally incoherent. "Actually," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended, "the load distribution calculations involve more complex considerations than that." I spent the next 5 minutes providing the detailed, accurate explanation that Dr. Jones had requested, demonstrating my deep understanding of the engineering principles involved. But the damage was done. The audience had witnessed Eric attempting to claim expertise he didn't possess, and my correction had created an awkward tension on stage. After the presentation, as we mingled with attendees, I overheard Dr. Fitz speaking quietly with another symposium organizer. "I'm not sure what happened there," she was saying. "We invited Anna Lewis specifically because of her individual technical contributions, but her partner seemed to think this was a joint presentation about their business philosophy." "It's unfortunate," the other organizer replied. "The audience came for engineering insights, not marketing presentations. Maybe next year we should be more explicit about inviting individual experts rather than business partnerships." My heart sank. My opportunity to establish independent professional recognition had been damaged by Eric's inability to recognize boundaries between his role and mine. Worse, his fumbled attempt to answer technical questions had potentially undermined my credibility with peers who might have become valuable professional connections. Walking back to our car, Eric was oblivious to the disaster that had just unfolded. "That went well," he said enthusiastically. "Dr. Jones seemed really interested in our approach, and I think we made some good connections for future projects." Our approach. Eric had transformed my individual technical expertise into a joint business opportunity, seemingly unaware that his presence had actually diminished rather than enhanced the presentation. "Eric," I said carefully, "that symposium was specifically about my engineering innovations. The audience came to hear technical details, not business philosophy." He looked genuinely surprised by my criticism. "Anna, we're partners. When you succeed, we both succeed. I was just providing context to help the audience understand the bigger picture of what we've accomplished together." What we've accomplished together. My individual breakthrough, developed during a solitary weekend of intensive problem-solving, had been permanently absorbed into Eric's narrative of collaborative achievement. But it was his next comment that truly revealed how completely he had rewritten our professional history. "Besides," he added with casual confidence, "you know you're not really comfortable with public speaking. I was just helping you feel more relaxed on stage by sharing the presentation load." I stared at him in complete shock. I had delivered flawless technical presentations throughout my career. I had spoken at conferences, pitched to clients, and explained complex engineering concepts to audiences ranging from city planners to construction crews. Public speaking had never been my weakness. It was one of my strengths. But in Eric's revised version of reality, I was someone who needed his support to handle professional presentations. My expertise had been reduced to technical knowledge that required his communication skills to be effectively shared with the world. That night, alone in our hotel room while Eric made networking calls downstairs in the lobby, I sat on the edge of the bed and realized something fundamental had broken between us. This wasn't just about credit or recognition anymore. Eric had genuinely begun to believe his own revised narrative of our professional relationship. In his mind, I was no longer the innovative engineer who had saved our biggest project and developed revolutionary construction techniques. I was his supportive partner who handled technical details while he provided the creative vision and business leadership that made our success possible. He had erased me so completely that he couldn't even see what he had done. The confrontation I had been avoiding finally happened 3 weeks after the symposium disaster. I found Eric in our home office working late on a proposal for a luxury resort development in Monterey. The irony wasn't lost on me. It was another coastal project that would require exactly the kind of innovative foundation engineering that had made our reputation. "Eric, we need to talk," I said, closing the door behind me. He glanced up from his laptop, already wearing that expression of patient tolerance that had become his default response to my concerns. "Sure, what's on your mind?" I sat down across from him, trying to organize thoughts I had been rehearsing for days. What happened at the symposium wasn't okay. You turned my individual presentation into something it was never meant to be. "Anna, come on," he said, leaning back in his chair. "The presentation went fine. Maybe it wasn't exactly what you had planned, but we reached the audience effectively." The audience came to hear about my engineering innovations. Instead, they got a business pitch about our collaborative methodology and watched you stumble through technical questions you couldn't answer. Eric's jaw tightened slightly. I was providing context. Those engineering details don't exist in a vacuum. They're part of a larger business strategy that I've been developing for years. Business strategy? The words came out sharper than I intended. Eric, the floating foundation system isn't a business strategy. It's a technical innovation that I developed alone during a weekend crisis while you were asleep. "We've been through this before," he said, his voice taking on that familiar edge of irritation. "Partnership means we share credit and responsibility. I've been handling the business development that makes your technical work commercially viable." "But that's not what you said at the symposium. You presented yourself as co-developer of the engineering innovations, not as the business partner who helped market them." Eric stood up and walked to the window, his body language suggesting this conversation was an unwelcome interruption to more important work. "Anna, I think you're being overly sensitive about attribution. The important thing is that our firm is successful, not who gets individual credit for specific contributions." Overly sensitive. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. My legitimate concerns about professional recognition were being dismissed as emotional overreaction. "This isn't about sensitivity," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "It's about accuracy. When Dr. Jones asked about load distribution calculations, you tried to answer using terminology you don't understand. You made us both look unprofessional." "I was demonstrating that our firm has comprehensive expertise," Eric replied, not turning away from the window. "Clients want to feel confident that they're working with a complete team, not just a technical specialist who needs a handler." A technical specialist who needs a handler. The casual cruelty of that description took my breath away. In Eric's mind, I had been reduced to someone with narrow expertise who required his broader business acumen to be effectively utilized. "Eric, look at me," I said. He turned, and I could see frustration etched across his features. "I'm not a technical specialist who needs handling. I'm an architect and engineer who has developed innovations that transformed our industry. The Ocean View project, the floating foundation system, the adaptive coastal construction methods, those weren't collaborative brainstorming sessions. They were individual breakthroughs that I achieved through my own expertise and effort. And they never would have become commercially successful without the business framework I built around them. Anna, you're brilliant at solving technical problems, but you've never understood the client relations, marketing, and strategic positioning that turn innovations into profitable ventures." There it was. the fundamental disrespect that had been growing beneath the surface of our relationship. Eric genuinely believed that my technical expertise was valuable only when filtered through his business capabilities. In his worldview, innovation without commercialization was worthless, and I was incapable of the latter. So my role is to create things, and your role is to make them matter? I asked. Your role is to excel at what you're best at, he said, his tone taking on a patronizing quality that made my skin crawl. You're an extraordinary engineer, Anna, but engineering is only one component of running a successful architectural firm. I handle the components you're not equipped for. Not equipped for? As if client relations, strategic thinking, and business development were sophisticated skills that required special talent, while engineering was merely technical competence that anyone could learn. What exactly do you think I'm not equipped for? I asked. Eric sighed, settling back into his chair as if preparing to explain something obvious to someone who should already understand. Networking, for one thing. You're uncomfortable in social situations with potential clients. You prefer technical discussions to the relationship-building conversations that actually generate business. I prefer substantive conversations to small talk, I corrected. But I've successfully pitched to clients, presented at conferences, and built relationships with contractors and engineers throughout my career. With my support, he said quickly. Anna, you're not naturally comfortable with the interpersonal aspects of business development. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just not your strength. I stared at him, realizing that Eric had constructed an entire narrative about my professional limitations that justified his expanding role in our partnership. In his version of reality, I was someone who needed his intervention to communicate effectively with clients, present my ideas coherently, or navigate professional relationships successfully. When did you start believing I was incompetent at everything except engineering? I asked quietly. The question seemed to catch him off guard. That's not what I said. I said you have strengths and I have strengths, and successful partnerships leverage both. But you've been systematically taking over every aspect of our business except the pure technical work. You handle all client communications, you represent us at industry events, you make strategic decisions, you control our professional relationships. What exactly am I contributing besides engineering calculations? You're contributing the innovations that make our firm special, he said, his voice softening slightly. Anna, your technical brilliance is the foundation of everything we've built. I'm just making sure the world recognizes and rewards that brilliance appropriately. But that wasn't what was happening, and we both knew it. Eric wasn't showcasing my technical brilliance. He was absorbing it into a joint identity where he received equal credit for my individual innovations. If my technical work is so valuable, I said, why have you been presenting it as collaborative development? Why do clients think the floating foundation system emerged from our joint creative process rather than from my individual problem solving? Eric's expression shifted, and for the first time in our conversation, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. Because clients prefer to work with teams rather than individuals. They want to feel like they're hiring a comprehensive firm, not a single specialist. So you've been lying to them about how our innovations actually developed. I've been positioning our work in the most commercially advantageous way, he said defensively. Anna, this is exactly what I mean about business acumen. Sometimes commercial success requires strategic presentation of technical achievements. Strategic presentation. Eric was describing deliberate misrepresentation of my individual work as collaborative effort and calling it business strategy. What happens when clients ask technical questions you can't answer? I asked, like Dr. Jones did at the symposium. That's why you're there, Eric said, his patience clearly wearing thin. You handle the technical details, I handle the relationship management. It's a division of labor that plays to our respective strengths. But it wasn't a division of labor. It was Eric claiming credit for my innovations while relegating me to the role of technical support for his presentations. I was being erased from my own professional identity, one client meeting at a time. Eric, I said, standing up to leave, I think you've forgotten who actually created the work that built our reputation. I think you've forgotten who made that work commercially viable, he replied, not looking up from his laptop. As I reached the door, he called out one last comment that revealed everything I needed to know about how our relationship had deteriorated. Anna, you might want to think carefully before you start questioning the partnership that's made your career possible. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Eric was suggesting that my professional success was dependent on his continued involvement, and that challenging his authority might jeopardize everything we had built together. But he had it exactly backward. Our success had been built on my innovations and his marketing of them. The question was whether I was brave enough to find out what would happen if I reclaimed ownership of my own achievements. 2 weeks after our confrontation, Eric announced that he had hired a new marketing coordinator to help expand our client outreach. Her name is Elise Meister, he said over breakfast, scrolling through his phone with unusual enthusiasm. She has an impressive background in architectural marketing, and she's specifically interested in promoting innovative coastal construction techniques. Something about his tone made me look up from my coffee. There was an energy in his voice that I hadn't heard in months, the kind of excitement he used to reserve for discussing breakthrough engineering solutions or major client victories. "Where did you find her?" I asked. "She reached out to us directly," Eric replied, still not making eye contact. "Apparently, she's been following our work since the Ocean View project. She has some really innovative ideas about how we can better position ourselves in the luxury development market." Elise started the following Monday. She was striking in a polished, professional way, tall, confident, with the kind of sharp intelligence that immediately commanded attention in business settings. During her first team meeting, she presented a comprehensive analysis of our firm's market positioning that was genuinely impressive. "Lewis and Associates has developed revolutionary coastal construction methods," she said, clicking through a slick presentation, "but you're not effectively communicating the broader implications of these innovations. You're positioning yourselves as technical specialists rather than visionary leaders." I found myself nodding along with her analysis. She was right that we had been underselling the transformative potential of my engineering work. But something about her phrasing felt subtly off. She consistently referred to Lewis and Associates as a collective entity, never acknowledging the individual contributions that had created our innovations. "The floating foundation system isn't just an engineering solution," Elise continued. "It's a paradigm shift that challenges how the entire industry thinks about coastal development. We need to position Eric as a thought leader who's reimagining the relationship between architecture and environment." Eric as a thought leader. My stomach tightened as I realized what was happening. Elise's marketing strategy was built on the same fundamental misattribution that had been growing in our business relationship. She was positioning Eric as the visionary creator of innovations I had actually developed. After the meeting, I approached her privately. "Elise, I noticed you focused heavily on positioning Eric as the innovative force behind our coastal construction methods. I'm actually the engineer who developed the floating foundation system and most of our technical breakthroughs." She smiled with practiced professionalism. "Of course, Anna. Eric explained the division of roles to me. Your technical expertise is crucial to implementing his creative vision. My job is to help clients understand how those innovations fit into a broader architectural philosophy." His creative vision. In the span of a single conversation, Elise had absorbed and reinforced Eric's revised narrative of our professional relationship. I was the technical implementer. He was the creative visionary. Over the following weeks, I watched Elise transform our marketing materials with disturbing efficiency. Our website was redesigned to emphasize Eric Lewis's innovative approach to coastal architecture. Press releases described Eric Lewis and his team developing revolutionary construction techniques. Client proposals highlighted Eric's breakthrough thinking in sustainable coastal development. My name appeared in these materials as Anna Lewis, principal engineer, positioned as a key member of Eric's team, rather than as a co-founder with her own areas of expertise. Every innovation I had developed was presented as an example of Eric's creative leadership, translated into technical reality through his capable team. But the professional rebranding was only part of what made me uncomfortable about Elisa's presence in our office. She had an easy familiarity with Eric that seemed to extend beyond their working relationship. She would linger in his office after meetings, their conversations shifting from business topics to personal anecdotes and shared jokes. When she laughed at his comments, her hand would briefly touch his arm in a gesture that felt more intimate than professional. I told myself I was being paranoid. Eric and I had been together for years, and our relationship had survived various professional collaborations. Just because our personal dynamic had become strained didn't mean I should suspect ulterior motives in every new professional relationship. But small details began accumulating that were harder to dismiss. Elise always dressed slightly more formally on days when Eric had external meetings, as if she were preparing for public appearances alongside him. She began attending client meetings that didn't require marketing input, positioning herself as Eric's strategic advisor rather than as a specialized contractor. Most troubling was how she began inserting herself into conversations about my technical work. When potential clients asked about the engineering details of our innovations, Elise would smoothly redirect the discussion toward Eric's design philosophy and the broader vision behind these technical solutions. During one particularly painful client meeting, Harrison Gould, the developer for whom I had originally created the floating foundation system, asked specifically about the load-bearing calculations for a new coastal project. Before I could respond, Elise interjected, "Eric can explain the conceptual approach behind those calculations. Anna, perhaps you could prepare the detailed technical specifications for Mr. Gould to review separately." She had transformed a direct question about my engineering expertise into a request for Eric to explain concepts while I prepared supporting documentation. I was being relegated to the role of technical assistant in discussions about my own innovations. The most disturbing moment came during a strategy meeting about our 5-year business plan. Elise presented a vision for expanding our firm that positioned Eric as the creative director of a larger organization specializing in innovative coastal development. Eric's reputation as a visionary architect gives us the foundation to build a much larger practice, she explained. We could license the floating foundation methodology to other firms, establish consulting relationships with major developers, maybe even create an educational program for emerging architects. License the floating foundation methodology. She was discussing commercializing my individual innovation as if it were Eric's intellectual property that he could distribute to other professionals. Actually, I interrupted, the floating foundation system is my engineering innovation. Any licensing arrangements would need to acknowledge my role as the primary developer. The room fell silent. Eric's expression tightened with embarrassment, while Elise looked genuinely surprised by my objection. "Of course," Elise said smoothly. "I should have said Eric's team's innovations. The point is that the firm has developed valuable intellectual property that could be leveraged for much larger business opportunities." Eric's team's innovations. My individual breakthrough had been absorbed into Eric's collective intellectual property so completely that even discussing licensing arrangements didn't require acknowledging my specific contributions. After the meeting, I confronted Eric privately. "Did you tell Elise that the floating foundation system was a team development rather than my individual work?" "I explained our collaborative process," Eric said defensively. "Anna, you're getting caught up in semantics. The important thing is positioning our firm for growth, not parsing individual attribution for past projects. It's not semantics when someone is discussing licensing my innovations without acknowledging that I created them." "Our innovations," Eric corrected. "And Elise understands the business implications better than either of us. She's helping us think strategically about leveraging what we've built together." But that wasn't what was happening. Elise was helping Eric leverage what I had built individually, while positioning him as the creative force behind technical work he had never actually performed. That evening, as I sat in our home office reviewing the latest marketing materials, I realized something had fundamentally shifted in the power dynamics of our relationship. Eric was no longer just claiming credit for my individual work. He was building an entire business expansion strategy around the premise that my innovations were his intellectual property. With Elisa's professional marketing expertise supporting his claims, Eric was transforming from a business partner who took excessive credit into someone who genuinely believed he owned the technical breakthroughs that had built our reputation. And I was running out of time to reclaim ownership of my own professional identity before it was permanently absorbed into Eric's expanding narrative. But what I didn't yet realize was that Eric and Elise's collaboration extended far beyond marketing strategy. Their professional partnership was about to reveal a personal dimension that would change everything. The moment that shattered my remaining illusions happened on a Thursday evening in late October. I was working late in our home office, finalizing structural calculations for a new waterfront development, when Eric came home from what he had described as a client dinner with potential investors. "How did the meeting go?" I asked, not looking up from my computer screen. "Fine," he replied tersely, heading straight for the shower. "Just the usual networking stuff, nothing you'd find interesting." Something in his tone made me pause. Eric usually enjoyed debriefing after client meetings, sharing details about promising leads or potential project opportunities. His dismissive response felt uncharacteristically evasive. 20 minutes later, as he emerged from the bathroom, his phone buzzed with a text message. I watched his face light up as he read it, the kind of genuine smile I hadn't seen from him in months. "Good news from the meeting?" I asked. Eric quickly put his phone face down on the dresser. "Just some follow-up details, nothing urgent." But I had seen enough. The smile, the quick concealment of the message, the subtle shift in his energy, all suggested that his client dinner had been something more personal than professional. The next morning, Eric announced he would be attending a weekend architectural conference in San Francisco. "It's mostly focused on sustainable design trends," he said, packing his overnight bag. "Elise thinks it would be good for me to establish connections with some of the emerging firms working in environmental architecture." "Elise is going too?" I asked. "Yes, she's handling the networking strategy. It makes sense for her to be there to identify potential collaboration opportunities." A weekend conference, together, with the woman who had been gradually inserting herself into every aspect of our professional relationship. "I could come along," I offered. "Sustainable design is directly relevant to my engineering work." Eric paused in his packing, and I could see him calculating his response. "Anna, you know you don't really enjoy those conference environments. Besides, someone needs to stay here and manage the Morrison project deadlines." "You don't really enjoy those conference environments." The same dismissive characterization he had used to exclude me from networking events and client meetings. But this time, the exclusion felt more pointed, more deliberate. After Eric left, I sat in our empty house feeling a familiar sense of unease that I couldn't quite articulate. Something fundamental was shifting in our relationship, but I couldn't identify exactly what was happening or how to address it. That evening, my phone rang. It was Stephen Fitz, an old colleague from graduate school who worked for a major architectural firm in San Francisco. "Anna, I thought I saw Eric at the Marriott downtown this afternoon," Stephen said. "I was going to say hello, but he was with someone I didn't recognize, and they seemed to be in an intense conversation." My stomach tightened. He's at a sustainable design conference, probably networking with potential clients. "That's funny," Stephen replied. "I checked the conference listings for this weekend, and I didn't see any major architectural events scheduled. Maybe it was a private industry gathering?" After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone, processing what Stephen had just told me. Eric was in San Francisco, supposedly at a conference that didn't exist, with someone Stephen didn't recognize. I spent the weekend consumed by suspicions I couldn't quite name. When Eric returned Sunday evening, he was unusually energetic and talkative, full of stories about breakthrough presentations and innovative approaches to coastal development that he had encountered at the conference. "It was exactly what we needed," he said, unpacking his bag with visible enthusiasm. "I made some connections that could transform how we position ourselves in the market." "What was the most interesting presentation?" I asked. Eric paused, clearly caught off guard by the specific question. "There was a fascinating discussion about adaptive foundation systems, very similar to what we've been developing, actually." Adaptive foundation systems, my engineering innovation, described as something he had encountered rather than something he had supposedly helped develop. "Who presented it?" I pressed. "A firm from Portland," Eric said vaguely. "I didn't catch all the details, but Elise thought their approach had some interesting applications for our work." Elise thought. Everything Eric had supposedly learned or experienced at this mysterious conference was being filtered through Elise's perspective and recommendations. The final confirmation came the following Tuesday. I was meeting with a contractor about material specifications when I happened to check my personal email. There was a message from the conference center where Eric claimed to have spent the weekend, a promotional email thanking recent visitors and encouraging them to book future events. The message included photos from the weekend's activities. I scrolled through images of wedding receptions, corporate retreats, and family celebrations. No architectural conference, no sustainable design presentations, no professional gatherings of any kind. Eric had lied, completely and deliberately. That evening, I confronted him directly. We were in our kitchen, the remains of a barely touched dinner between us. Eric, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. He looked up from his phone, already wearing that expression of patient tolerance that had become his default response to my concerns. What's on your mind? Where were you this weekend? I told you, at the Sustainable Design Conference in San Francisco. What was the name of the conference? Eric's jaw tightened slightly. Anna, why are you interrogating me about work travel? Because there was no Sustainable Design Conference in San Francisco this weekend. I checked. The silence that followed felt like a physical presence in the room. Eric's expression shifted through multiple emotions: surprise, calculation, irritation, and finally, something approaching defiance. Anna, you're being paranoid. Just because you can't find information about a small industry gathering doesn't mean it didn't happen. Stephen Fitz saw you at the Marriott. He said you were with someone he didn't recognize, and there were no architectural conferences happening anywhere in the city. Eric stood up from the table, his body language shifting into full defensive mode. Stephen was mistaken. He saw someone who looked like me. Eric, just tell me the truth. Where were you this weekend? He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a cold edge that I had never heard before. I was working on business development that's crucial to our firm's future. Sometimes that requires meetings and networking opportunities that don't fit into traditional conference formats. Business development with Elise, in a city where he had claimed to be attending a conference that didn't exist. Who were you meeting with? I asked quietly. Potential clients and strategic partners, people who could transform our practice if we handle the relationships correctly. Was Elise there? The question hung between us like a challenge. Eric's expression hardened into something I had never seen before. Not just irritation or impatience, but genuine anger at being questioned. Yes, Elise was there. She's our marketing coordinator, Anna. It's literally her job to facilitate these kinds of strategic relationships. Eric, what is your relationship with Elise? She's a colleague, he said firmly, a professional partner who understands the business side of our practice better than either of us. That's all? That's all. But the way he said it, too quickly, with too much emphasis, told me everything I needed to know. Eric was lying, and he was getting careless about concealing his deception. She's just a colleague? I pressed. Eric's face flushed with frustration. Anna, yes, she's just a colleague. Stop creating problems where none exist. Just a colleague. The words would echo in my mind for weeks afterward, because I knew with absolute certainty that Eric was lying to my face with the same casual confidence he had used to claim credit for my professional innovations. He didn't respect me enough to craft a convincing lie. He simply expected me to accept whatever narrative he constructed, regardless of how obvious the deception had become. That night, as Eric slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and realized that our relationship had crossed a line I hadn't even known existed. This wasn't just about professional credit or strategic disagreements anymore. Eric was betraying me personally while systematically erasing me professionally. And he was doing both with someone who was actively helping him rewrite the story of my own achievements. The woman he claimed was just a colleague was becoming the architect of my complete disappearance. The next morning, Eric left early for what he described as a site inspection for a potential project in Marin County. His departure felt hurried, almost frantic, as if he couldn't wait to escape the tension that had settled over our house after the previous night's confrontation. "I'll probably be late," he said, avoiding eye contact as he gathered his keys and laptop. "The client wants to walk the entire property, and then we might grab dinner to discuss preliminary concepts." Another vague explanation, another potential evening away, another opportunity for him to be somewhere I couldn't verify. After he left, I sat in our kitchen drinking coffee and staring at my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me seemed like a stranger, someone who had spent years accepting dismissals and erasures, someone who had gradually allowed herself to become invisible in her own life. But something had shifted after last night's conversation. Eric's casual lies about the San Francisco conference had shattered whatever trust remained between us. If he could lie so easily about his weekend activities, what else had he been concealing? I walked to our shared home office, ostensibly to work on the technical drawings for our latest coastal project. But as I sat at my drafting table, my eyes kept drifting to Eric's desk across the room. His laptop was gone, but various papers and file folders remained scattered across the surface. For 3 years, I had respected the boundaries of our individual workspaces. Eric's desk was his domain, just as mine was my own. But those boundaries had been established when we were genuine partners who trusted each other completely. Now, I wasn't sure what we were. I approached Eric's desk cautiously, as if I were trespassing in a stranger's office. Among the scattered papers, I found project notes in his handwriting, client contact information, and marketing materials that Elise had prepared for various proposals. But it was a small leather notebook, half hidden beneath a stack of invoices, that caught my attention. The cover was worn, suggesting it had been used regularly, and Eric's initials were embossed on the front. I had never seen this notebook before. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The pages contained what appeared to be meeting notes and strategic planning thoughts written in Eric's distinctive scrawl. But as I read through the entries, a disturbing pattern emerged. The first few pages contained legitimate business planning notes, client meeting summaries, project timelines, marketing strategy ideas. But gradually, the content shifted towards something more personal and calculating. Elise suggests positioning A as technical support rather than co-innovator. Clients respond better to single visionary narrative. A, Anna. Me, my own boyfriend, was referring to me by my initial, as if I were a business problem to be managed rather than his romantic and professional partner. Need to establish E as primary marketing voice. A's direct technical presentations confuse non-engineer clients. E, Elise. The notebook revealed a systematic strategy for marginalizing my role in our firm while elevating Elise's influence over our business operations. But it was the entries from recent weeks that made my stomach drop. Weekend conference strategy successful. A didn't question details. E says we should plan more frequent business development trips. A becoming suspicious about time away. Need to establish clearer boundaries between professional and personal relationship management. Professional and personal relationship management. Eric was treating our romantic relationship as a strategic challenge that required careful handling while he developed something else with Elise. The final entry was dated just 2 days earlier. E agrees that A's resistance to new marketing approach is limiting growth potential. May need to consider restructuring partnership to minimize her operational involvement. E could transition from contractor to permanent strategic partner. I read that entry 3 times, each reading making the implications clearer. Eric and Elise weren't just having an affair, they were planning to push me out of my own firm. The technical innovations I had developed, the engineering breakthroughs that had built our reputation, the professional identity I had spent years establishing, all of it was being systematically transferred to a partnership that excluded me entirely. I photographed every page of the notebook with my phone, my hands shaking as I documented the evidence of Eric's calculated betrayal. Then, I carefully returned the notebook to its position beneath the invoices, ensuring that Eric wouldn't realize I had discovered his planning. As I sat back at my drafting table, pretending to work on technical drawings, my mind raced through the implications of what I had just discovered. This wasn't a spontaneous affair or a gradual drift in our relationship. Eric had been deliberately planning my professional and personal erasure with someone who was actively helping him steal credit for my innovations. The floating foundation system that had saved the Ocean View project, the adaptive coastal construction methods that had established our reputation, the revolutionary engineering solutions that clients specifically sought out, all of it was being repositioned as Eric's creative vision, with Elise as his strategic partner and me as an increasingly unnecessary technical consultant. But Eric had made one critical mistake in his planning. He had underestimated my capacity for strategic thinking. If he could plan my erasure, I could plan my reclamation. That afternoon, I began my own notebook. Over the following week, I maintained a careful facade of normalcy while conducting my own investigation. I documented Eric's schedule discrepancies, photographed additional planning notes when I found them, and began reaching out to old professional contacts under the guise of routine networking. But my most important call was to someone Eric had never considered a threat, Dr. Anton Jones, the coastal engineer from UC Berkeley who had asked the technical question Eric couldn't answer at the symposium. Anton had approached me after that presentation, clearly impressed by my engineering expertise, despite the awkward dynamics on stage. "Anna, what a pleasant surprise," Anton said when I called him. "I was just thinking about our conversation at the Regional Architecture Council Symposium. Your work on floating foundation systems is genuinely revolutionary." "Thank you, Anton. Actually, that's part of why I'm calling. I'm exploring some opportunities to expand the application of those engineering innovations, and I wondered if you might have time to discuss potential collaborations." There was a brief pause. "I'd be very interested in that conversation. To be honest, I was somewhat confused by the presentation dynamics at the symposium. Your partner seemed to be claiming co-development credit for innovations that were clearly your individual engineering work." Anton had seen exactly what I had hoped someone would notice. "That's actually become a significant issue," I said carefully. "Eric's business development focus has led to some misunderstandings about the technical origins of our innovations." "Anna, I've been in this field for 25 years. I can recognize breakthrough engineering when I see it, and I can also recognize when someone is claiming credit for work they didn't actually perform. Your floating foundation system is the kind of innovation that comes from deep technical expertise, not collaborative brainstorming." His validation felt like oxygen after months of suffocating dismissal. Here was a respected professional who could clearly distinguish between my individual technical contributions and Eric's marketing narratives. "Would you be interested in meeting to discuss potential independent applications of the engineering system?" I asked. "Absolutely. I've been working with a development group that's been struggling with coastal construction challenges that your innovations could solve perfectly. But Anna," he paused, "are you planning to continue working with your current partner?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications. Anton was asking whether I was prepared to reclaim individual ownership of my technical work. "That partnership may be evolving," I said diplomatically. "Good, because frankly, your individual expertise deserves better representation than what I witnessed at the symposium." We arranged to meet the following week at his Berkeley office. After hanging up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: professional excitement about my own capabilities, rather than anxiety about Eric's control over my career. But Anton was only the first step in a larger strategy I was beginning to formulate. If Eric and Elise were planning to marginalize my role in the firm I had helped build, I needed to establish my own professional foundation independent of their schemes. That evening, Eric came home from another client meeting, his mood unusually buoyant. He was checking his phone more frequently than ever, smiling at messages he didn't share, and making references to exciting developments that he couldn't discuss yet. "How was your day?" he asked, settling onto the couch beside me with a glass of wine. "Productive," I replied. "I've been thinking about some new applications for the coastal engineering work. There might be opportunities to license the innovations to other firms." Eric's expression shifted slightly. "Anna, we've talked about this before. Any licensing arrangements would need to go through proper business channels. Elise has been developing a comprehensive strategy for commercializing our intellectual property." Our intellectual property. My individual innovations had been so completely absorbed into Eric's business identity that he genuinely seemed to believe they belonged to both of us equally. "Of course," I said mildly. "I was just thinking about the technical possibilities." But that night, as Eric slept beside me, I lay awake planning something far more comprehensive than technical possibilities. I was planning my professional resurrection. The next morning, I made 3 more strategic phone calls. The first was to my old patent attorney, whom I hadn't spoken to since filing the original documentation for the floating foundation system. The second was to the engineering firm that had provided structural consultation for our OceanView project. The third was to Harrison Gold, the developer who had originally commissioned the innovation that launched our reputation. Each conversation confirmed what I had suspected. My individual contributions to our projects were far more substantial and documented than Eric's marketing narrative suggested. The patent applications were filed under my name as the primary inventor. The engineering consultations had been conducted through my technical specifications. The client relationships were based on their confidence in my problem-solving capabilities. Eric had built his expanding role on the foundation of my innovations, but he had never actually established legal or professional ownership of the work that made him valuable to clients. That gave me leverage I hadn't realized I possessed. By the end of the week, I had quietly documented every project where my individual contributions could be distinguished from our collaborative work. I had identified key professional relationships that were based on my technical expertise rather than Eric's business development. I had researched the legal mechanisms for protecting intellectual property and individual professional reputation. Most importantly, I had begun building a network of allies who recognized my individual value and were interested in working with me independently. Eric's mistake had been assuming that I was too passive, too technically focused, too uncomfortable with business strategy to challenge his expanding control over our professional partnership. He was about to discover how wrong he had been about my capabilities. My meeting with Anton Jones at UC Berkeley exceeded every expectation I had dared to form. His office overlooked the San Francisco Bay, and as we discussed the technical applications of my floating foundation system, I felt a professional confidence I hadn't experienced in months. "Anna, I've reviewed the patent documentation you sent me," Anton said, spreading the papers across his desk. "The innovations are filed entirely under your name as primary inventor. Eric Lewis appears nowhere in the technical specifications or development history." "That's because he wasn't involved in the engineering development," I replied. "His role was business development and client relations after I had solved the technical challenges." "Then legally, you own these innovations outright. Any licensing arrangements or commercial applications would require your explicit permission, regardless of your business partnership structure." The implications hit me like a physical force. Eric's entire strategy for expanding our firm was built on innovations he didn't legally control. His plans to marginalize my involvement while commercializing my engineering work weren't just ethically questionable, they were legally impossible without my cooperation. "Anton, what would happen if I chose to license these innovations independently?" He leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. "You could establish your own consulting practice tomorrow. Any developer interested in coastal construction using your methods would need to work directly with you as the patent holder." "What about existing client relationships that were developed through Lewis & Associates?" "Clients hire firms for specific expertise. If that expertise belongs to you individually, and if clients understand that, they're free to continue working with you in whatever professional context you choose." We spent the next hour discussing the practical logistics of establishing independent consulting relationships. Anton introduced me to two developers who had been struggling with coastal construction challenges that my innovations could solve. Both were immediately interested in working with me directly, bypassing Eric's firm entirely. Walking back to my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete professional autonomy. For the first time since Eric had begun his systematic erasure of my contributions, I could envision a future where my work was recognized and valued on its own merits. But establishing legal independence was only the first step. I needed to understand exactly what Eric and Elise were planning so I could protect myself from their schemes. That evening, I implemented the second phase of my strategy. While Eric was out at another mysterious client dinner, I accessed our shared business files using the administrative permissions I had helped establish when we first created Lewis & Associates. What I discovered was far worse than I had anticipated. Elise had prepared a comprehensive business plan for restructuring our firm as Lewis Coastal Development, with Eric as sole creative director and herself as strategic partner. The plan explicitly described my role as technical consultant rather than co-founder, positioning me as a specialized contractor rather than an equal partner. More disturbing was the financial analysis she had prepared. Elise had calculated the value of our existing client relationships, ongoing projects, and intellectual property assets. According to her projections, Eric could buy out my partnership stake for significantly less than my actual contributions were worth, if I could be convinced that my role had always been subordinate to his leadership. But the most shocking document was a draft partnership agreement between Eric and Elise that would formalize their professional relationship while pushing me out entirely. The agreement positioned Elise as Eric's business partner in all future developments of coastal construction innovations originally developed by Lewis & Associates. They weren't just planning to steal credit for my work, they were planning to steal ownership of it through legal restructuring that would erase my individual contributions from the historical record. I photographed every document, creating a comprehensive record of their scheme. Then I made copies of all financial records, client contracts, and project files that documented my individual contributions to our firm's success. If Eric and Elise wanted to play legal games with my professional identity, I would be prepared with evidence that established my actual role in creating the innovations they were trying to claim. The next morning, I called my patent attorney again. This time, our conversation focused on protecting my intellectual property from potential theft by business partners.
Anna, based on what you've described, you need to file additional documentation that establishes your individual ownership of all related innovations and prevents unauthorized licensing or commercialization, he advised. Can business partners override patent ownership through partnership agreements? Not legally. Patents belong to inventors, not to companies or partnerships. Any attempt to transfer patent ownership would require your explicit written consent. What if they try to claim the innovations were developed collaboratively? Patent law is very clear about invention versus collaboration. Technical development that can be documented as individual work cannot be retroactively claimed as collaborative effort. By the end of that call, I had established a legal firewall around my innovations that would prevent Eric and Elise from commercializing my work without my permission. But I wasn't finished. If they wanted to restructure our professional relationship, I would restructure it on my terms, not theirs. That afternoon, I began drafting my own partnership dissolution documents. The pieces of my counter-strategy fell into place over the next 2 weeks with methodical precision. While Eric and Elise continued their clandestine planning, believing I remained oblivious to their schemes, I was constructing a response that would expose both their professional betrayal and their personal deception simultaneously. The catalyst for my final plan came from an unexpected source: our anniversary dinner reservation. Eric and I had been together for exactly 3 years, and despite everything that had deteriorated between us, he announced that he wanted to celebrate with a special evening at Meridian, the upscale restaurant where we'd had our first official date. I thought it would be nice to reconnect, he said, his tone carrying a strange mixture of guilt and determination. We've both been so focused on work lately, maybe we should remember why we started this journey together. The irony was almost painful. Eric wanted to commemorate our relationship at the exact moment when he was planning to end both our personal and professional partnerships. But his suggestion gave me an opportunity I couldn't have orchestrated better myself. "That sounds perfect," I replied. "Should we invite anyone else or keep it intimate?" "Just us," Eric said quickly. "I think we need some time alone to talk about our future." Our future. The future he was planning with Elise while systematically erasing me from the present we had built together. I made the reservation for Friday evening, exactly 3 years to the day after our first date. But unlike Eric, I had no intention of limiting the guest list to 2 people. Over the next week, I carefully orchestrated the elements of what would become the perfect convergence of personal and professional revelation. I reached out to key clients, colleagues, and industry contacts, inviting them to what I described as a celebration of recent professional achievements. I positioned the gathering as a casual networking reception that happened to coincide with a personal milestone. Harrison Gold confirmed his attendance, intrigued by my hint about exciting developments in coastal construction innovation. Dr. Sylvie Fitz from the Regional Architecture Council accepted, expressing interest in my independent consulting work. Anton Jones agreed to drive down from Berkeley, bringing along 2 potential clients who had been seeking expertise in adaptive foundation systems. Most strategically, I invited Stephen Fitz, the colleague who had spotted Eric in San Francisco during his fictional conference weekend. Stephen's presence would provide an independent witness to Eric's pattern of deception. But the final element of my plan required the most delicate coordination. I needed photographic evidence of Eric and Elise's relationship that would demonstrate the personal betrayal underlying their professional conspiracy. The opportunity presented itself when Eric announced another weekend business development trip, this time to Los Angeles, to meet with potential investors in sustainable coastal development. "Elise will be handling the strategic presentations," he explained, packing his overnight bag with the same careful enthusiasm I had observed before his San Francisco trip. "When will you be back?" I asked. "Sunday afternoon, probably. These investors prefer extended consultation periods, so we might end up working through the weekend." After he left, I made a single phone call to a private investigator I had found through my patent attorney's recommendations. The conversation was brief and professional. "I need photographic documentation of a business trip to Los Angeles, about 2 people traveling together, potentially engaged in activities that contradict the professional nature of their stated purpose."
Hotel surveillance, restaurant documentation, that sort of thing? Exactly. Nothing intrusive, just clear evidence of their actual relationship dynamic. By Sunday evening, I had an envelope full of photographs that told the story Eric's words had been concealing for months. Images of him and Elise checking into a luxury hotel together, sharing intimate dinners at romantic restaurants, walking hand in hand along the Santa Monica Pier. The evidence was comprehensive, undeniable, and devastating. But I wasn't interested in confronting Eric privately with proof of his affair. That would give him the opportunity to construct new lies, manipulate the situation, or accelerate his timeline for pushing me out of our firm. Instead, I was planning to present the evidence at our anniversary dinner, in front of the professional network he had been systematically excluding me from, at the moment when he least expected his carefully constructed narratives to collapse. The photographs would serve as the perfect introduction to a conversation about honesty, partnership, and the real origins of the innovations that had built our professional reputation. Friday evening arrived with crystalline clarity. I dressed carefully for dinner, selecting the same style of professional attire I had worn during my most successful client presentations. This wasn't a romantic anniversary celebration, it was a business meeting disguised as a personal milestone. The envelope containing the photographs sat in my purse, along with copies of the patent documentation that established my individual ownership of our firm's core innovations. I had also prepared a brief presentation about my new independent consulting practice, complete with business cards and contact information for interested clients. As I drove to Meridian, I felt the same focused calm I had experienced during the Ocean View crisis weekend, the clarity that comes from knowing exactly what needs to be done and having the technical expertise to execute it flawlessly. Eric was waiting at our usual table, looking unusually nervous. He stood when I approached, kissing my cheek with the kind of performed affection that felt more like a business transaction than romantic gesture. "You look beautiful," he said, the compliment sounding rehearsed. "Thank you," I replied, settling into my chair. "I'm looking forward to celebrating everything we've accomplished together." Everything we've accomplished. The phrase would take on very different meanings over the next hour. What Eric didn't know was that our colleagues and clients would be arriving shortly, ready to hear the real story of how our innovations had been developed and who deserved credit for the work that had built our professional reputation. The reckoning was about to begin. We had been seated for exactly 10 minutes when the first of my guests arrived. Harrison Gold appeared at the restaurant entrance, scanning the dining room until he spotted our table. Eric's expression shifted from nervous anticipation to complete confusion as Harrison approached us. "Anna, wonderful to see you," Harrison said warmly. "And Eric, of course. I was intrigued by your invitation, Anna. You mentioned some exciting developments in your consulting work." Eric's face went pale. "Harrison, I didn't realize you were joining us tonight." "Anna invited several of us to celebrate her new independent practice," Harrison replied, settling into the chair I had reserved for him. "I have to say, I'm impressed by her decision to showcase her individual expertise. The floating foundation work she developed for our Ocean View project was genuinely revolutionary." Individual expertise, the floating foundation work she developed. Harrison's words established the narrative I needed before Eric could even attempt damage control. Over the next 15 minutes, our table filled with the professional network Eric had been systematically excluding me from. Dr. Sylvie Fitz arrived with 2 colleagues from the Regional Architecture Council. Anton Jones brought the potential clients he had mentioned. Stephen Fitz appeared with a knowing smile, clearly understanding that this evening would be more revealing than a simple anniversary celebration. Eric sat frozen in his chair, watching his carefully controlled professional environment transform into something he couldn't manage or manipulate. When Dr. Fitz asked about the innovative engineering work Anna has been developing independently, Eric's attempt at interjection was smoothly ignored. "Actually," I said, reaching into my purse, "I wanted to share something with everyone that I think illustrates the importance of honest professional relationships." I withdrew the envelope containing the Los Angeles photographs and placed it gently on the table. Eric's eyes locked onto the envelope with the recognition of someone who suddenly understands that their world is about to collapse.
Eric, you told me you were in Los Angeles this weekend for business meetings with potential investors, I said, my voice calm and clear. But these photographs tell a different story. I opened the envelope and spread the images across the table where everyone could see them. Eric and Elise at the hotel check-in counter, sharing an intimate dinner, walking hand in hand along the beach. The evidence of their relationship was undeniable and comprehensive. The silence at the table was absolute. Harrison's expression shifted from confusion to understanding. Dr. Fitz looked from the photographs to Eric with barely concealed disapproval. Anton nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. "Eric," I continued, "for 3 years you've been telling me Elise was just a colleague, but these photographs suggest otherwise." Eric's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The confident business developer who had been claiming credit for my innovations was reduced to speechless shock by evidence he couldn't deny or explain away. "More importantly," I said, withdrawing the patent documentation from my purse, "these photographs represent the same pattern of deception you've been using to claim credit for my professional work." I distributed copies of the patent filings to everyone at the table. The floating foundation system that built our reputation, the adaptive coastal construction methods that attracted these clients, the engineering innovations that established Lewis & Associates as industry leaders, all of these are documented as my individual technical achievements, not collaborative developments. Harrison studied the patent documents with growing amazement. "Anna, I had no idea that the Ocean View innovations were entirely your individual work. Eric always presented them as joint developments." "Because Eric has been systematically rewriting the history of our professional partnership," I replied, just as he's been rewriting the nature of his relationship with our marketing coordinator.
Eric finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Anna, please, this isn't. We can discuss this privately. We've been discussing this privately for months, I said. You've dismissed my concerns about professional recognition while planning to push me out of my own firm. You've lied about your relationship with Elise while claiming she was just a colleague. Tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity to set the record straight in front of the people who actually value honest professional relationships. I stood, addressing the table with the same confident authority I had once used in technical presentations before Eric began undermining my credibility. I'm announcing the launch of Lewis Coastal Engineering, my independent consulting practice, specializing in innovative foundation systems and sustainable construction methods. For anyone interested in working with the person who actually developed these innovations, rather than the person who claimed credit for them, I'll be happy to discuss your projects. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Harrison was the first to speak, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had just witnessed a complete reframing of a professional relationship he thought he understood. Anna, I'm embarrassed that I never questioned the attribution of the Ocean View innovations, he said, looking directly at Eric with obvious disapproval. Your engineering work saved that project, and you deserve full recognition for what you accomplished. Dr. Anton Jones leaned forward, his academic background clearly evident in how he processed the evidence I had presented. This explains the inconsistencies I observed at the Regional Architecture Council Symposium. Eric, you were attempting to answer technical questions about innovations you didn't actually develop. Eric's face flushed deep red, but he remained silent. What defense could he offer against documented patents and photographic evidence? Anna, said one of Anton's potential clients, we've been struggling with coastal foundation challenges on a development in Monterey. Based on what I'm seeing here, you're exactly the expert we need to work with. Within minutes, my impromptu presentation had transformed into an active consulting negotiation. 3 different projects were described, all requiring the kind of innovative engineering solutions I had been developing while Eric claimed credit for my work. But the most satisfying moment came when Dr. Sylvie Fitz addressed Eric directly. Eric, I have to say, this evening has been quite illuminating. The Regional Architecture Council specifically invited Anna to speak because of her individual technical contributions. Your attempt to co-opt that presentation was inappropriate and professionally misleading. I'm curious, added Stephen Fitz, about those business development trips you mentioned, the ones where you claimed to be attending conferences that didn't exist while you were actually in romantic locations with your colleague. The systematic dismantling of Eric's credibility was more thorough than I had dared to hope. Each revelation built upon the previous one, creating an undeniable pattern of deception and professional misconduct. Eric finally attempted damage control, his voice shaking with desperation. Anna, you're misrepresenting our partnership. Yes, Elise and I have developed a personal relationship, but our professional collaboration has always been legitimate. Eric, I replied calmly, claiming credit for patents you didn't contribute to isn't professional collaboration, it's intellectual property theft. Harrison nodded grimly. Anna, I think we need to discuss revising our current contract arrangements. If Lewis & Associates has been misrepresenting the origins of the technical innovations we're paying for, that's a significant breach of trust. The table fell silent as the full implications of what Harrison had just said became clear. Our largest client was publicly questioning the legitimacy of our professional relationship based on Eric's pattern of false attribution. Actually, I said, reaching into my purse one final time, I've prepared partnership dissolution documents that address exactly these concerns. I placed the legal papers on the table where everyone could see the official letterhead and formal language. These documents establish Lewis Coastal Engineering as my independent practice, with full ownership of all innovations I developed individually. Eric is welcome to continue Lewis & Associates as his own business development firm, but he no longer has any claim to the technical work that established our reputation. Eric stared at the documents with the expression of someone watching their entire professional identity dissolve in real time. The choice is simple, I continued. Sign these documents acknowledging my individual ownership of the innovations I created, or face legal challenges to your unauthorized use of my intellectual property. For the first time all evening, Eric's business development skills seemed to return. He understood leverage, and he understood when he had none. "I'll sign them," he said quietly. And with that simple statement, 3 years of systematic erasure came to an end. The signing happened in complete silence. Eric's hand trembled as he wrote his name across the dissolution documents, officially severing our professional partnership and acknowledging my individual ownership of the innovations that had built our reputation. Harrison witnessed the signature, along with Dr. Fitz and Anton, providing the legal validation that would prevent any future challenges to the agreement. As Eric finished signing, he looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before, complete defeat mixed with something approaching respect. "Anna," he said quietly, "I never meant for things to go this far." "Yes, you did," I replied, my voice steady and certain. "You planned every step of my erasure, Eric. The only thing you didn't plan was my response to it." The remainder of the evening transformed into an impromptu business consultation. While Eric sat in stunned silence, I found myself engaged in detailed discussions about coastal engineering projects, speaking with the same confident authority I had possessed before Eric began undermining my professional identity. Harrison immediately expressed interest in transitioning his ongoing projects to Lewis Coastal Engineering. "Anna, I want to work with the person who actually developed these innovations, not someone who was taking credit for them." Anton's clients were equally enthusiastic, describing foundation challenges that required exactly the kind of creative engineering solutions I specialized in. By the end of the dinner, I had preliminary agreements for 3 major projects, all of which would provide the financial foundation for my independent practice. But the most satisfying moment came when Dr. Fitz extended a new invitation. "Anna, the Regional Architecture Council would like to offer you a keynote presentation slot at our annual conference next spring. This time, we'll ensure you have the platform you deserve to discuss your innovations without any interference." Eric's face went white at the implication. The professional network he had been systematically excluding me from was now actively choosing to work with him instead of him. As the evening wound down and our guests began to leave, each person made a point of shaking my hand and expressing their respect for how he had handled the situation. Several mentioned that they had suspected something was wrong with the professional dynamics they had observed, but hadn't understood the full scope of Eric's misrepresentation until tonight. "Anna, you've done something remarkable here," Stephen said as he prepared to leave. "Not just professionally, but personally. It takes courage to confront that level of systematic deception." Finally, only Eric and I remained at the table, surrounded by empty chairs and the debris of what had once been our shared professional identity. "What happens now?" Eric asked, his voice hollow. "Now, you learn to succeed based on your own capabilities, rather than claiming credit for mine," I replied. "Lewis & Associates can continue as your business development firm, but Lewis Coastal Engineering owns the innovations, the patents, and the technical expertise that built our reputation." "And us? Personally?" I studied his face, searching for any remnant of the man I had fallen in love with 3 years earlier. But that person had been gradually replaced by someone who could systematically erase my contributions while planning my professional and personal betrayal. "There is no us, Eric. There hasn't been for months. You just forgot to tell me you had already moved on." He nodded slowly, understanding that the dissolution extended far beyond our professional partnership. "For what it's worth," he said, standing to leave, "you were always the real genius behind everything we built. I just got lost trying to take credit for it." "I know," I replied simply. And with that acknowledgement, 3 years too late, Eric walked out of the restaurant and out of my life. I sat alone at our anniversary table, surrounded by the evidence of my reclaimed professional identity, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, complete ownership of my own achievements. 6 months later, I stood in my new office overlooking the Pacific coast, reviewing blueprints for a revolutionary sustainable housing development that would use my floating foundation technology on an unprecedented scale. The project represented everything I had fought to reclaim: recognition for my individual innovations, direct client relationships built on my expertise, and complete creative control over the engineering solutions I developed. Lewis Coastal Engineering had exceeded every projection I had dared to make during those dark months when Eric was systematically erasing my contributions. The 3 projects I had secured at our anniversary dinner had led to referrals, which had led to industry recognition, which had established my reputation as the leading innovator in adaptive coastal construction. The keynote presentation at the Regional Architecture Council had been a turning point. Speaking to an audience of 500 engineers and architects, I had presented my work without interruption, without co-option, without anyone attempting to claim collaborative credit for my individual achievements. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. But the most satisfying vindication came from an unexpected source. Harrison Gold had recommended my services to a major development consortium planning a luxury resort in Hawaii. The technical challenges were immense: unstable volcanic soil, seismic activity, environmental restrictions that made conventional construction impossible. I spent 2 weeks developing a revolutionary foundation system that combined my floating technology with seismic dampening innovations I had been developing independently. The solution was elegant, environmentally sound, and technically advanced beyond anything currently available in the industry. When I presented the design to the consortium, their lead engineer asked a question that brought everything full circle. "Dr. Lewis, this is groundbreaking work. Who else contributed to these innovations?" "No one," I replied with quiet confidence. "These are my individual engineering solutions developed through my research and technical expertise." The consortium awarded me a $15 million consulting contract that afternoon. Eric's fate had been quite different. Without access to my innovations, Lewis & Associates had struggled to maintain its reputation for technical excellence. Several clients had transferred their projects to my firm after learning about the misattribution of my work. The business development skills that Eric had always considered his strength proved insufficient when clients realized he couldn't deliver the engineering innovations that had originally attracted them. I heard through industry contacts that Eric and Elise had eventually formalized their personal relationship, though their professional partnership had been less successful. Elise's marketing expertise couldn't compensate for Eric's lack of genuine technical innovation, and their firm had been forced to focus on conventional projects that required no breakthrough engineering. The last I heard, Eric was working as a project manager for a large construction company, handling logistics rather than claiming credit for innovations he hadn't created. It wasn't the career trajectory he had envisioned when he was systematically claiming ownership of my achievements. But I felt no satisfaction in his professional decline. I had never wanted to destroy Eric. I had simply wanted him to acknowledge the truths about our respective contributions to the work that built our reputation. His downfall had been a consequence of his own choices, not my revenge. As I stood in my office that evening, reviewing the contracts and project proposals that filled my schedule for the next 2 years, I reflected on the journey from invisibility to recognition. The woman who had once served wine while men discussed her own innovations was now being consulted by major corporations for her individual expertise. The floating foundation system that Eric had tried to claim as collaborative development was now internationally recognized as my signature innovation. Universities were teaching courses based on my engineering methods. Industry publications featured my work on their covers. Most importantly, I was visible again, not as someone's partner or technical support, but as Anna Lewis, the engineer who had revolutionized coastal construction through her individual brilliance and determination. I had reclaimed not just my professional identity, but my sense of self-worth. The photos that had exposed Eric's deception were filed away in a folder I rarely opened. That evidence had served its purpose, but dwelling on betrayal wasn't how I wanted to build my future. Instead, I focused on the work that had always defined me, solving impossible engineering challenges, creating innovations that pushed the boundaries of what architecture could achieve, building structures that would stand for generations with my name on them. Eric had been wrong about many things, but he had been right about one crucial detail. We were building an empire together. He just hadn't understood that the empire was built on my foundation, not his claims to credit. Now, the empire belonged to me alone, and I was building it exactly as I had always envisioned, one revolutionary innovation at a time.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.